For those who don't know, Final Fantasy XV is a mess. It's one of my favorite games of all time, but it is an absolute train wreck in some aspects. It was in development for 10 years, switched directors halfway through, and has gone through numerous overhauls, including a title change. What we know today as Final Fantasy XV originally began as a game called Final Fantasy Versus XIII, and would have been quite different from what we ended up getting. This video won't focus too much on what 15 ended up being, but will instead talk about the chaotic development of Versus XIII and how it became Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy Versus XIII was a game planned for the PlayStation 3 as part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy series. It was intended to be a companion game to Final Fantasy XIII proper, alongside the mobile game Final Fantasy Agato 13, all of which would share the same mythos. Many of the initial themes stayed true into 15, most notably the overall theme of Versus XIII, which was to be a fantasy based on reality, with the game taking place in a setting similar to contemporary Earth. Final Fantasy XIII would go on to become its own series with 13-2 and Lightning Returns, while Agato would become Type 0, also directed by 15's final director, Hajime Tabata. Versus XIII never took a coherent shape, and all concepts were eventually reworked or scrapped entirely in place of what is now Final Fantasy XV. The Fabula Nova Crystallis trilogy was unveiled in 2006 but became an oddity of sorts in the following years, with numerous showcases followed by delays and often just long periods of silence. At E3 2013, Versus XIII was officially re-announced as the newly branded Final Fantasy XV, and after another long 3 years would finally see the light of day. Compared to the finalized version of its successor, the world of Final Fantasy Versus XIII was rooted heavily in the lore of the Fabula Nova Crystallis, with an indirect but still influential presence. What would later evolve into a cross-continental road trip with the boys actually began with a much darker and serious tone, with an emphasis on examining the cast's humanity. Final Fantasy Versus XIII's setting presented a world where 4 nations once had crystals, but lost them to warfare fueled by coveting the other nations' crystals. Lucis remained the only nation with a crystal and thus prospered thanks to their crystal's magic and influence. The rest of the world developed in the field of military power and warfare and grew distant from Lucis. The tensions soon grew into a political and strife-driven Cold War. The nation of Niflheim would have united the other nations under its banner as its solution to lay Lucis at siege for its crystal. It's unclear what measure the lore of the Fabula Nova Crystallis and the influence of Etro would play in this. The nation of Lucis originally was said to have worked akin to a mafia crime family since the nation's ancient beginnings, and despite its peace was said to have engaged in strict rule, including a ban on firearms and a lockdown in the capital city. Noctis was the crown prince, and Regis the current king. Ignis, Gladiolus, and Prompto, Noctis' team members, acted as his entourage akin to a Yakuza Kyodai Shitai structure, which essentially translates to Big Brother, Little Brother. Etro was a patron goddess of Lucis, known as the Goddess of Death, and Lucis thus had a dark design, being only portrayed at nighttime, and had prevalent Grim Reaper motifs. The royal family and other citizens of Lucis were to wear black to go with this theme. This is obviously a stark contrast to the current theme of a more standard monarchy with Crownsguard to protect the royal family. The game was to open with a formal party to celebrate the treaty signing between Lucis and Niflheim, where Stella Nox Fleuret talked to Noctis about a legend from her home country of Tenebrae. Stella would later be scrapped entirely in favor of Lunafreya Nox Fleuret. The legend stated that whenever Etro opens the unseen gate, the souls of the dead ascend as a streak of light to the heavens and through the gate. When few among the living see the light, they are given power from the kingdom of the dead. Stella stated she can see the light, as could Noctis. Noctis guessed that she had had a near-death experience since he had during his childhood, which is what granted him his ability to see the light. The treaty signing would turn out to be a ruse, allowing Niflheim forces to storm the city in order to steal its crystal. Noctis and his friends fought their way through soldiers and behemoths until he came face to face with a mysterious white-clad man who also appeared to wield the power of the crystal. This character would later become Ravus Nox Fleuret. You would even fight Stella at one point, who would display the same power to summon weapons via magic. Gentiana was also in Versus, with her original role being that of Stella's messenger and a contact point between the countries of Tenebrae and Niflheim. This is most of what is known of the original story, as Tabata has described Versus as more of an idea than an actual game. Most of what can still be seen in promotional material for Versus is either heavily scripted slices made to be more a tech demo than an actual game, leading to further speculation of whether there was ever any actual combat system or not. The Versus XIII name came into play in juxtaposition to Final Fantasy XIII and its sequels that take place in fantastical worlds that are literally and culturally disconnected, like Cocoon and Grand Pulse in Final Fantasy XIII. For Final Fantasy Versus XIII, Square wanted the world to be different from the original Final Fantasy XIII by presenting one whole connected world. Unveiled at E3 2006 with a trailer, Final Fantasy Versus XIII was said to be not merely a sequel but a wholly independent story unfolding in a different world with different characters. The game was to be developed by the team responsible for the Kingdom Hearts series, with Tetsuya Nomura as director and character designer. He would not, however, have been the costume designer, as Square Enix signed a contract with Japanese fashion brand Rowan to promote their clothing designs in the game through the different characters. Rowan creative director Himuro Takahata served as the game's costume designer, but before his designs were implemented, Noctis was shown wearing a placeholder attire designed by Nomura. You just gotta fucking get in there, Nomura, you always do. The production team was bare bones for a period of several years, with Eiji Kitada, a digital artist and then employee of Square Enix Visual Works department, the division responsible for CG cutscenes, and one other person doing all of the CG work together. Kitada wrote in his blog at the time that other projects took precedence, but that one of the first things he participated in on the Visual Works team was Final Fantasy Versus XIII's pre-production. The person he worked with was the modeling supervisor on the project, and he was the lead position, and the duo handled all of the pre-production modeling and rendering. Final Fantasy VII Advent Children Complete was running as a separate project, and the two also supported the Advent Children team. The game's engine history implies a lot about its development process. Square Enix revealed Crystal Tools at Game Developers Conference 2008, which means that the real-time conversation they showed off between Noctis and Stella a few months later was likely some of the first content actually created for the game. Despite its 2006 announcement, chances are that not much more than concepts and a trailer existed for Final Fantasy Versus XIII until nearly 2 years later. After nearly a year of silence, Final Fantasy Versus XIII was briefly shown at Tokyo Game Show 2009 in a private theater showcasing the game's first gameplay footage, though Nomura commented it was merely a demo and most footage would not be used in the final game. He said the clip was made just to prove that the game was still in development. At Jump Festa 2010, Noctis' new outfit was put on display. It had a more modern look with a jacket and pants as opposed to his old outfit from past trailers. After Final Fantasy XIII launched, resources could finally be shifted back to the Final Fantasy Versus XIII project, but technical issues were now bringing the project nearly to a halt. According to then technology director Julian Mercerin, the Universal Engine Motomu Toriyama's team built for Final Fantasy XIII couldn't handle Versus XIII anymore because it had been designed to fit the former's specification, and buckled under the open-world environments designed for Versus, making it virtually unusable. Ultimately, Square Enix was forced to commission the creation of a brand new engine for Final Fantasy Versus XIII called Luminous Studio. During an interview with Famitsu, Nomura stated he was unsure whether Versus would be shown at E3 2010. When E3 took place, the game was not shown. On January 18, 2011, Square Enix held the first production department premiere. It was originally named the Fabula Nova Crystallis Conference, and the original date was set on January 11. The event included new trailers and the announcement of official release dates. Fans got to hear Noctis speak for the first time along with the other characters. Besides Final Fantasy Versus XIII, the event featured new video content for Final Fantasy Type 0, Dissidia 12 Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts 3D Dream Drop Distance, Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep Final Mix, and other titles. Square Enix hinted at several new titles to be revealed at this event, such as the later released Final Fantasy XIII-2. In the summer of 2011, Square Enix got its first look at the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, which threatened to make the PlayStation 3 exclusive Final Fantasy Versus XIII irrelevant before it was even finished. Sticking to the game's origins was no longer an option, and the project had to change. In July 2011, in an interview with Tetsuya Nomura, it was revealed that Final Fantasy Versus XIII hadn't yet entered full production. He went on to say the date for the next showing of the game had been set. In early August, for the 500th issue of Dengeki PlayStation magazine, Nomura stated Final Fantasy Versus XIII would not be shown at Tokyo Game Show 2011 in September. On August 31, 2011, a renewal for the trademark of Final Fantasy Versus XIII was filed by Square Enix. On September 10, 2011, during the Final Fantasy XIII-2 fan meeting, producer Yoshinori Kitase was questioned about the development of Final Fantasy Type 0 and Final Fantasy Versus XIII. His answer was, for Type 0 and Versus XIII, we are giving 100% to development. In the Japanese gaming magazine Famitsu, Nomura announced the game will be a mix between real-time cutscenes and pre-rendered cutscenes with a ratio of 7:3, 70% real-time and 30% pre-rendered. He stated the next time the game would be shown, there would be a demonstration using real-time footage. Nomura said working on Final Fantasy Versus XIII took priority in response to fans' request for a Final Fantasy VII remake. On July 24, 2012, the then Square Enix president Yoichi Wada posted a tweet discussing rumors that arose about the game being cancelled after a long period of media silence, also hinting its progress would surprise its fans, particularly in the game's city environments. On September 1st, in the event of Final Fantasy's 25th anniversary, Tetsuya Nomura did a sketch of Noctis for the event, congratulations on the 25th anniversary, please wait for his turn to appear. On October 10th, Nomura said that Final Fantasy Versus XIII was still in development and asked fans to wait for more detailed news regarding the game. In 2012, it was decided development would shift to next-generation consoles and the name was officially changed to Final Fantasy XV within the company, although the public revelation of the rebranding would wait until E3 2013. In July 2012, around the time of the cancellation rumors, WATA ordered the Final Fantasy Type 0 team to join the Final Fantasy XV development team to create a prototype for the next-gen consoles. The team working on the game got resized from 200 workers to around 20 in 2012, right before the arrival of Hajime Tabata and the Final Fantasy Type 0 team. In December, Hajime Tabata became co-director to finish the project, which would eventually have him transition as the new director. He sat down with Nomura about the direction of the title to ensure that characters like Noctis would be maintained in the best way possible. Tabata has later said that when Final Fantasy Versus XIII became Final Fantasy XV, it was around 25% complete. Tabata spearheaded a massive restructuring effort where not even the most well-publicized parts of Final Fantasy Versus XIII were safe. Stella would eventually be cut altogether and many features Nomura had personally praised, like character switching in battle, were scrapped. On February 21, 2013, GameSpot reported that Shuhei Yoshida, the president of Sony Computer Entertainment Worldwide Studios, said about Final Fantasy Versus XIII that, "I have some knowledge, but I'm not in a position to talk about it." On March 19, 2013, VG Leaks reported that not only had production been halted because of the failure and subsequent rebuilding of Final Fantasy XIV, but that it had been moved to the PlayStation 4 and was being co-developed by Sony as a PlayStation 4 exclusive, and was reworked into Final Fantasy XV. Square Enix refused to comment. On April 17th, during the inaugural episode of Square Enix Merchandise Radio, Tetsuya Nomura spoke briefly about the game. "It's a delicate situation within the company. The date for our next reveal is set and we are working towards preparing information for that. Perhaps the details as to why information couldn't be released might be touched upon within the next information announcement." During Sony's press conference at E3 on June 10, 2013, a pre-recorded video of Tetsuya Nomura was played where he acknowledged that not much information on the project has been released as of late, and while he couldn't immediately share new details, new information would be revealed in the coming days. Following the message, a new trailer for the game played, with the end of the trailer announcing that the game had been renamed Final Fantasy XV, with development moved to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. Nomura was reassigned to other projects within the company, including Kingdom Hearts 3, while Tabata took up full directorial duties to bring the project to completion. Tabata officially became the director in December 2013. The separate engine, gameplay, graphics, and design sections of the team were also merged into one unit to help with development. Development initially followed the pattern of previous high-budget games, but the team eventually realized that such techniques had become dated. During the later part of development, Tabata's main concern was keeping the game on schedule instead of letting the development become delayed by experimentation with the technology. The company also kept the game's budget under strict control despite the prolonged development. A major issue was deciding what elements to carry over and what had to be changed or discarded, as the project was already known and fans had expectations. When describing his attitude to development, Tabata described the team's setup as horizontal, using a non-hierarchical staff structure to help speed up exchange of information and feedback between departments. This drastic shift was unheard of for a major Japanese game developer, and he was met with a mixed reaction from the staff. Some were elated at their new freedom while others felt downgraded. Including the initial work on Versus XIII, the game's development spanned approximately 10 years from conception to release. Despite its origins, Tabata considers Final Fantasy Versus XIII and XV to be two separate entities. That wraps up pretty much all that is known about the development of Versus XIII, and for the rest of this video I just want to take a minute to list a bunch of things that actually carried over from Versus to XV. Because so much of Final Fantasy Versus XIII had been presented via trailers and other forms of media, one of Tabata's main goals in developing XV was to preserve the elements users were aware of and excited about. While this served as inspiration, there were elements that didn't fit the new conception. However, the main party of Noctis, Gladiolus, Ignis, and Prompto remains for Final Fantasy XV, although their designs were revised. Kor was the fifth permanent party member in Final Fantasy Versus XIII, but his role was reduced and became a mentor-like figure to the party in Final Fantasy XV, only appearing a couple of times throughout the entire game. The black car that appeared in Versus XIII trailers appears to be a precursor of sorts for the Regalia in the final game. The base story of the Kingdom of Lucis protecting the world's crystal and being able to wield its power is still present. Noctis is an equivalent of the Warrior of Light, and he can see the light of souls when wielding the Ring of the Luci. He still had a near-death experience in childhood, although it didn't grant him any supernatural powers. Though the intended opening for Final Fantasy Versus XIII of Noctis meeting Stella at the treaty signing party was scrapped, the idea did morph into the film Kingsglaive Final Fantasy XV. Instead of Noctis meeting Stella before the painting of Etro, Nyx Ulrich meets Lunafreya Nox Fleuret in a scene that pays homage to the Versus XIII opening. As the treaty is to be signed, the white-clad Imperials and the black-clad Lucians draw their weapons upon one another in a scene reminiscent of that from Final Fantasy Versus XIII. A lot of the music composed for Final Fantasy Versus XIII is still part of the Final Fantasy XV soundtrack, such as Somnus and Omnis Lacrima. The locales also appear similar, as a nighttime metropolis and a gas station on a desert were shown for Versus XIII, and similar locations still remain in Final Fantasy XV. The female Dragoon from Versus XIII trailers is introduced in Final Fantasy XV as Aranea Highwind. The white-robed man from early material, as stated before, became Ravus Nox Fleuret. The suit that the King wore in the Versus XIII trailers is still worn by the redesigned King Regis and Noctis himself as DLC. Noctis wears the suit he wore in the opening for Final Fantasy Versus XIII at the end of Final Fantasy XV. The character Gintiana and the dog Umbra were redesigned for Final Fantasy Versus XIII and remain for Final Fantasy XV, albeit recast with new roles. There was also going to be an Imperial general named Safay Roth, originally implied to be the main villain, as Arden Izunia was created after Roth was cut. While Arden remained in 15, Safay Roth was cut, although the text SAF can still be read on Imperial dropships in reference to the character Safay Roth. If the player equips a Royal Arm as their main weapon and defends against ballistic fire in Final Fantasy XV, the Royal Arms will summon around Noctis to deflect bullets. This effect was first seen in the Final Fantasy Versus XIII reveal trailer, where Noctis descends the stairs of the Citadel towards soldiers firing at him. Also shown in early Versus XIII trailers, Noctis' eyes were shown turning red. In Final Fantasy XV, this does happen when he summons Astrals. And lastly, Final Fantasy XV uses the same logo art but with new colors. When the player completes the game, the logo also changes to a newer version. This pretty much wraps up the long and painful development of Final Fantasy XV. While there are understandably tons of mixed opinions about the game, it truly is one of my favorites. It's just very ambitious and incredibly fun. And while it is an absolute mess of cut content and plot holes, I think that if you just go into it with a clear mind, you'll have a great time. Anyways, I'll just leave it at that and wrap it up here. So as always, if you have any suggestions for other topics to cover, regardless of what game they might be about, let me know down below and I'll check them out. That's it for this video. See you all in the next one.